G-Man Boxing. Do you know what I mean? Every single live he donates. I see him on other lives donating. He's got the bag on it.
Alright, before I get into this video, just a quick plug, if you could, in the comment section, I'm pinning the link to what you'll see there on screen. It's a website called Wild Design. Great stuff coming up for Christmas. Stuff for your girlfriend, boyfriend, etc. Just great things around the house. A great bunch of people run that company. They've been very good to me. I'm returning the favour, giving them a few plugs. If you could, link in the description. I'll pin their website in the comment section as well. Let's talk boxing. About this time last week, WBC announced that they'd given the go-ahead for Canelo versus their champion, Ilunga Makabu, at cruiserweight for the WBC cruiserweight title next year at some stage. Now, if Canelo takes that fight, which I expect him to, if he wins it, which I also expect him to, that will make him a 5-division world champion. And it got me thinking, Canelo's resume, is it really all it's cracked up to be? Is he as good as people make him out to be? Well, in my opinion, yeah. Yeah, he definitely is. We're going to have a look at his resume. We're not going to go in, full in-depth look at his resume, but we're going to look kind of early on in his career when he kind of came to public attention and some of his subsequent fights. We're going to have a look. We're going to talk about Canelo in this video. And then we're going to ask in the future, where does it end? How would we rank him amongst the greats? Does he need to do more? Has he done enough? Or what else can he do? Because he's been talked about going on for another couple of years. He could retire now, in my opinion, and it's already a Hall of Fame resume. He could retire now with what he's done. But let's have a look. Let's talk about Canelo Alvarez. Let's see what the F is the deal with Canelo Alvarez. Now, Canelo Alvarez, he started boxing when he was 13 years old. Alright? That was when he was an amateur. Now, in Mexico, it's quite common for Mexicans to have very short amateur careers and learn extensively in their pro careers. So they will have an insane amount of pro fights against really cab drivers, journeymen, whilst not really having much time as an amateur. Now, Canelo, he turned pro when he was about 15. He started boxing when he was 13. His amateur record consists of 46 fights. He won 44 of them, lost 2. He only had 12 knockouts. Now, bear in mind, a 13-year-old boy is not going to have the same punching power as a 23, 24-year-old boy. It's just not going to happen. Unless your name is Mike Tyson. It's just not going to happen. So, Canelo Alvarez turned pro in 2005 on the 29th of October. Alright, now his first fight was against a guy called Abraham Gonzalez. He won that fight via 4th round TKO. Gonzalez had the very impressive record of 0-1-0. So he'd only had one fight which he lost. Pablo Alvarado, again, same record. That was a stoppage win. Then he had a split decision in his 3rd pro fight. Now again, Canelo he wouldn't have even been 16 at the time. But this was against a guy called Miguel Vasquez. Does that name ring a bell? That is the same Miguel Vasquez, by the way, who fought the likes of O'Hara Davis, Lewis Ritson, won both them fights but didn't get the decision, got horribly robbed them both, was stopped by Josh Taylor. Yeah, that Miguel Vasquez. That was at 140 pounds that Canelo Alvarez fought when he was 16. That was on Vasquez's pro debut, and it was a split decision win over 4 rounds. He then actually had a draw against a guy called Jorge Rueza. That's probably how you pronounce that. He did actually, as far as I'm aware, rematch Miguel Vasquez. And I'll just try and follow. Yes, he did. And that was on a 10-round unanimous decision. They fought at 148 pounds in that fight. But that was quite some way after Canelo had first fought him. For example, Canelo going into that fight was actually 19-0 at the time. So, big difference. So, he went from having a fight with him in his 3rd fight to having a rematch over 10 rounds many fights later. So, at this stage, Canelo was 19-0. He's fighting very, very consistently. I mean, for example, let's just read 2006. He had a fight in January, then he had a fight 20 days later in February, had a bit of a break until June, and then he had a fight in June, July, fought twice in September, once in December, had 2 fights in the month of March in 2007, and how many fights did he have in 2007? May, June, August. He had 2 fights in August and one. Very active, For an up-and-comer, very active. Canelo Alvarez has a couple of brothers. They're all boxers as well. None of them have the same talent as Canelo, and that was really what inspired Canelo to get into boxing. I think he said to one of his brothers, it might have been Ramon, that he wanted to be just like him. And his brother's quoted as saying, no, don't be like me. You're going to be better. And Canelo has, well, he's definitely sought to that. A lot of these fights were in Mexico. The first time I ever remember seeing Canelo was the highlights of this fight here in 2010, which was Jose Miguel Cotto. Now, that is the brother of Miguel Cotto, who Canelo would end up actually fighting. That was on the undercard of Floyd Mayweather versus Shane Mosley. Canelo was kind of getting a name at the time. People were starting to recognise him. Like, he was only, again, like, he would have only been 19 at that time, because it would have been just shy of his 20th birthday. And in all honesty, that fight was interesting, because to look at Canelo in that fight, you wouldn't actually think much of him. You would have kind of thought that this is a kid that maybe doesn't take a shot too well, because he looked very, almost like a fish out of water at times in that fight. He was hurt very, very badly in the first round against Jose Miguel Cotto. And, you know, he done well to get out of the first round, it has to be said. And if you ever go back and watch that fight, there's one thing to take notice. And this is really how you can tell you're onto something here. Canelo in that fight, when he was hurt, and bear in mind, Floyd Mayweather was hurt badly against Mosley on the same card later on. What do both of them guys have in common? It was their calmness. When they were both hurt, how calm they were. Now, Floyd Mayweather at that time was wily. You know, he wasn't, you know, Floyd Mayweather knew what he was doing at that time, right? But he was able to stay calm. Canelo was only 20 years old, 19 years old actually, but he was able to stay calm. Even though he didn't look amazing against Jose Miguel Cotto, he was still able to remain calm. And he was able to end up stopping Cotto in the 9th round. Now, this fight here, Carlos Baldomir. Now, that fight, I believe, was actually set at a catch weight. It was set at a catch weight, I think, 151 pounds, or in around that, because Baldomir actually came in a little bit over that. Now, he was still under the weight for the light middleweight limit, but I remember at the time it was on HBO. They said that Baldomir was actually fined for that, but Canelo Alvarez at the time refused to take it. You know, it would have went on to his person, he refused to take it. Baldomir was tough. Although he had 12 losses at the time, he was tough. He'd gone the distance with guys like Floyd Mayweather. People were asking the question, you know, can Canelo stop him? Because he sure as hell seen better days at the time. But people wanted to know, could he actually stop him? Could he potentially go in there and stop Baldomir? And he was winning the fight comfortably throughout 6. But as Larry Merchant said, he showed me everything apart from punching power. And no sooner did that words be mentioned from Larry Merchant that Canelo Alvarez found the left hook, knocked Baldomir damn near out cold. You know, he showed that he had punching power. Now, at that stage, Canelo Alvarez, as I said, he was still fighting. He could still probably just barely do welterweight at the time. You know, actually, funny enough, only a few months ago, he was actually doing welterweight. So people were thinking, you know, is he going to stay at, is he going to go down to welterweight? Some people actually were saying his punches will have more effect at that weight. But he ended up getting the fight for a vacant title at 154 pounds. This is when you start to see the WBC really kind of favour Canelo and become a darling, because he ended up fighting for a vacant WBC 154 pound title against Matthew Hatton, who had never fought at 154 pounds and actually weighed 149 pounds for this fight. That was a real case of Canelo just, there's your title basically. So he went in over 12 rounds, you know, just beat beat Matthew Hatton, who is actually training Campbell Hatton now, beat Matthew Hatton decisively, did get a point deducted for hitting. I remember that, it was kind of, yeah, they were kind of in a break and he hit him kind of more like the back, almost around the back of the head he hit Matthew Hatton. But I remember that. Then he went on to fight Ryan Rhodes, got rid of him in 12 rounds. Alfonso Gonzalez, I remember that fight well actually. So Canelo Alvarez at this time was making a name for himself. He was fighting these guys, he was defending his title. The fight that interests me here, we talked about here, is Shane Mosley in 2012. And I remember this was the time when I really was starting to become a fan of boxing, and Canelo Alvarez was kind of one of my kind of like marquee fighters to watch at this time. And I remember the Shane Mosley fight. Shane Mosley had seen better days, much better days. He'd seen much better days when he fought Floyd, much less when he's fighting Canelo at 154 pounds. Lest we forget, Shane Mosley, you'd probably say, was at his best at lightweight. So Canelo Alvarez, clockwork display, did what he needed to do. The Josecito Lopez win, I remember that win very well, actually. I mean, Josecito Lopez fought Canelo in 2012. The start of 2019, he was having competitive fights with Keith Thurman for welterweight titles. So, and Canelo, now that was at 154 pounds, it has to be said, but Canelo really just dominated that fight. I mean, I remember the knockdowns. Canelo's hand speed looked quite good in that fight. His combination punching looked quite good. His mixture to head to body looked very good. So I was impressed with Canelo. Then he fights Austin Trout. Now, we remember this fight quite well. It's one of them fights where Canelo, I thought he won the fight, personally. I thought the knockdown in the 7th round, and saying that, the 7th round was actually a very competitive round, even with the knockdown, because he knocked Austin Trout down very early on in the round with a right hand that Trout's little feet did a funny dance and went down. But Austin Trout, in that 7th round, if you go back and watch it, he actually took over after the knockdown. And many people, even on commentary, I think that was on Showtime, even said that you could actually argue that the 10-9 round. Personally, I would still give it 10-8. Well, we got to the end of that fight. It was a close fight. It was competitive the whole way through. But Canelo looked so assured of himself. Like, at the time you're looking at it, you're thinking, it's a close fight, mate. Very close. And then they read the scorecards out. 118, 109, 116, 111. And the best scorecard, well, in my opinion, or the most accurate, was the 115, 112. And you're like, wow, Canelo got that decision, but he got it fairly wide. Now, 2 of them scorecards were not close at all. Some people were surmising that maybe it was because Floyd Mayweather was reported to be next, and no one wanted to get in the way of that. Who knows? But all I know is Austin Trout should have felt hard done by in that fight. You know, the fact that they were so wide when it was a competitive fight the whole way through. I thought Canelo nicked it, but he definitely showed that he struggles a bit with guys who move. His skill of cutting off the ring, not amazing at the time. Not terrible, but not amazing. He prefers it when fighters definitely seek him and he can just light them up. His foot speed, certainly at 154 pounds, was not amazing as well. So there was a few kind of question marks there. But then he was going to go in and fight Floyd. Now, the Floyd Mayweather fight, it was fought at a catch weight of 152 pounds. And at this time, Canelo realistically had outgrown 154 pounds. He really had, because after the Austin Trout fight, he fought Floyd Mayweather at 154 pounds. And he actually didn't fight at that weight division until 2016, 3 years later, when he fought Liam Smith. Because that's how much he was struggling, that he ended up having to fight at Canelo weight thereafter. So, the Floyd Mayweather fight, although it's listed as a majority decision, we all know it was unanimous. You could give Canelo at best 2 rounds in that fight. It was an absolute schooling. It was a rout by Floyd. He really put Canelo in his place in that fight. It was a case of, Canelo was only 23 years old at the time, very young, and it was a real case of man against boy. And some people use the analogy man against boy when they talk about, you know, a fighter who has his man strength just bossing a fighter who doesn't. Well, I use this as a very case of Floyd Mayweather being the man who was savvy. He knew it all, he knew his skills, and he was putting this kid in his place. You know, I like to talk about history and use historical contexts to describe boxing, because people describe boxing as the art of war. And if you look back at wars, or, you know, civil wars or whatever that have been fought throughout the ages, throughout the centuries, you can always kind of take a little bit of it and use it as an analogy with boxing. And one analogy I like to think of when I think of that fight is a time in England under the reign of Henry II, when it was, I think it was 1173, where his 3 eldest sons rebelled against him. And they were only young at the time. They would have been probably in their early 20s. Some would have been in their teens. His son Henry, the young king, Richard, who would go on to be Richard the Lionheart, and their middle son Geoffrey, Plantagenet. They rebelled against their dad, the king, and they lost that because they didn't have the intelligence. You know, they didn't have the wit that Henry had. They didn't have the resources, and they didn't suffer anything really in the grand scheme of things. And they really kind of rebelled because they just didn't get enough inheritance, you know. But that was kind of an example where it was just the young kids, you know, deciding to, you know, let's try and flex our muscles, and being put in their place pretty quick by the more experienced fatherly figure. That's kind of how I see the Floyd fight versus Canelo. You know, it really taught Canelo, I taught him a lot, I would imagine. It didn't help that he was at 152 pounds, because, as I said in previous videos, even cutting 1 pound when you're dehydrating yourself artificially is a stretch. And that's probably the worst I've ever seen Canelo on the scales. You know, for that fight, he really looked terrible. I mean, you could see the veins just everywhere. He looked terrible on the scales for that fight. And and I do question, was there a rehydration clause in it? Because he only rehydrated to 168, I think it was. And normally he rehydrated a lot more than that. You know, but he would have lost that fight anyway, as far as I'm aware, as far as I'm concerned anyway. How CJ Ross scored that fight a draw, I will never ever know. She's never judged since, by the way. But how she scored that fight a draw is beyond me. It really is. Next fight after that was against Alfredo Angulo, and he did look quite good in that fight. He dominated that fight throughout. Stopped Angulo with the uppercut while he was still standing. Referee had seen enough, and that was a perfect stoppage. It really was. Now in 2014, in July of 2014, this was a fight that I was interested in very much so at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, you're not a year removed from the Floyd fight, and you're facing Erislandy Lara, who is so awkward, so long for the weight, because he's even longer arms than Floyd, can move. I was thinking, oh boy, that could be a banana skin for Canelo. Again, this fight took place at 155 pounds, Canelo weight as it was being referred to, and in my opinion, unbiased opinion, I've watched the fight several times. I actually had a scorecard. I thought I had the scorecard saved from the last time I watched it a little while back, but I didn't. I thought Canelo won the fight. Very, very close fight. 115-113 is my scorecard. One judge scored at that. Levi Martinez, who's returned some very bizarre scorecards in his time as a judge, he scored at 170-111 for Canelo. And Jerry Rott, who was an excellent judge as well, he scored the fight for Lara. He was a good judge back in his day. He's retired now. Now, Lara in that fight, at times, especially the third round, really did put a schooling on Canelo. But Floyd, when he did it, he was throwing punches. He wasn't running around the ring and not landing shots like Erislandy Lara was. And Canelo, in that fight, showed a better ability to cut off the ring. We saw the improvements there that would eventually lead to what we have now, in my opinion. So he was able to cut the ring off a lot better. He was able to, land body shots, hard body, and they were affecting Erislandy Lara. Go back and watch it, you could see it. He was uncomfy at times when Canelo was letting them body shots go. It did slow him down. It made him reduce to running around the ring. So Canelo Alvarez got the win. I felt legitimately, personally. Some people say Lara won. I wouldn't have necessarily an issue if you scored it close to Lara, personally. But for me, from my opinion, I've watched it several times, I felt Canelo Alvarez won it. Very close fight. It wasn't a case of, like, the 170-111 scorecard, I don't know how he got that, because it wasn't that kind of fight. It was a nip and tuck, kind of, depends what you like. I've always been someone who favours the aggressor, unless the aggressor is really just being absolutely schooled. I've always been someone who does favour that. Then we saw, Canelo was out of the ring for a while then, by his standards anyway at the time. He returned the week after Mayweather had fought Pacquiao. And that was against James Kirkland. Now, on paper, that had all the makings of an instant classic. James Kirkland was going to come straight at Canelo. James Kirkland was more a volume puncher than a necessarily devastating puncher. And he did have a questionable chin. Now, I thought that fight would go a little bit longer than it did. But from the first round, you could see the writing was on the wall. Canelo damn near could have stopped James Kirkland in the first round. He didn't. He stopped him in the third round. He couldn't miss Kirkland with the uppercut. And it was the uppercut that knocked him down the first time in the third round. And as we all know, the famous shot that Canelo Alvarez landed, the jab to the body, kind of almost like a feint jab to the body and over the top right hand. Kirkland's chin, we all know the slow motion image of it kind of jangling. And I remember watching a video on YouTube where they edited the video in such a way that Canelo Alvarez was taken out. So you couldn't see Canelo in the video, you could only see the shots landing. And you could really get appreciation for the actual force of the shots that was being landed by Canelo. He was lighting Kirkland up in there. It was a fun display. In my opinion, probably knockout of the year in 2015. In fact, definitely. I mean, that was a savage knockout of James Kirkland. Had a fight then with Miguel Cotto, and that was for the WBC middleweight world title, also for the diamond title. Now, that fight right there, I think the Ring Magazine title was also on the line in that fight. That right there was a fight that at the time I was looking forward to. I couldn't really pick a winner because Cotto had been looking decent, at that division at middleweight. But he came in under the light middleweight limit for this. He was 153 pounds. Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, won the fight, but it was a very, very close nip and tuck competitive fight. it was real case of an 8-4 kind of 7-3 kind of scorecard, or 7-5 scorecard I should say. It was a very close nip and tuck fight. The scorecards don't reflect that though, funnily enough. Burt Clement 118, 110, Canelo, David Moretti 119, 109, and John McKay 117, 111. Does not reflect what actually took place in the ring. It was a good little scrap, it has to be said. Canelo never came close to really knocking Miguel Cotto out. So he moved on, onwards and upwards. It was at that time we started hearing a name. Triple G, Gennady Golovkin. He just come off a win over David Lemieux. And that was the name we were hearing about for Canelo. We were hearing that name, Triple G, Gennady Golovkin. Were we going to get it next? Is Canelo going to fight Triple G? They'd sparred together. They sparred together a few years prior. Canelo was younger at the time, but they had sparred together. So we were wondering, were we going to get that fight? Well, the next fight that was coming, we didn't get the Canelo Triple G fight. We got a fight that shocked us. Certainly shocked me. I remember I think I was sitting on my phone home from work at the time, and I seen an image pop up on my screen, and it said Amir Khan versus Canelo, and I thought, this is clearly photoshopped. And I go on BoxRec, and it was legit. He was going to fight Amir Khan the 7th of May for the WBC middleweight title at a catch weight of 155 pounds. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I really couldn't. I thought, that is suicide for Amir Khan. I mean, Danny Garcia hits hard. Marcus Maidana hit hard. Canelo Alvarez could knock a horse out. And you're going to go in there with him? That's not going to end well. I actually thought that fight would end very early, and I thought that Canelo wouldn't need to catch Amir Khan flush to hurt him and knock him out. Subsequently, Amir Khan started out very quickly. I gave him the first 2 rounds, but I felt Canelo took over thereafter. So and there was a lot made about the scorecards. You know, Glenn Feldman had Canelo ahead, Glenn Trowbridge had Canelo ahead, Adelaide Bird. Remember that name, Adelaide Bird? You'll be hearing about it now in a few minutes. She had Amir Khan winning. Personally, the 3rd round could have really gone either way. The first 2 rounds, yes, they were Amir Khan rounds, definitely. But once Canelo started landing the body and he kind of acclimatized with the speed, I don't have an issue with the scorecards personally. I mean, Canelo, in my opinion, the 49 scorecard, 49-46 scorecard, yeah, I can see kind of that because Khan won the first 2 rounds pretty clearly. But nevertheless, if you have the Glenn Feldman card, 48-47, I have no issue with that because that's how I had it at the time of the stoppage. Brutal knockout. Amir Khan was knocked out cold. Knocked him out cold, so bad so that Canelo got on his hands and knees. It's almost like if a dad is playing with his son and he accidentally hurts his son. That's kind of what it's like. He just kind of looked like that, like, oh, what did I do? That's how it was, literally. So, question was it going to be Golovkin next? Are we going to get Golovkin next? No, not getting Golovkin next. In fact, I remember at the time there was word going around that they had actually signed to fight just a year after, in 2017. That was kind of the rumour mill that was going around at the time. We were hearing actually names mentioned. We were hearing names like Billy Joe Saunders mentioned. You know, potentially because he did a version of the middleweight title at the time. So we were hearing potential unification with him, Billy Joe Saunders. But then actually, inexplicably, he vacates WBC title. And it was given to Gennady Golovkin because Gennady Golovkin, inexplicably, was his mandatory because WBC have this thing they do now and again where even though Triple G had an IBF, he had a WBA, and that was it really. He had those two titles. They mandated him for the WBC, which they don't do. Other sanctioning bodies don't do. WBC did it, and Canelo took exception with it. And he was really harsh. He was really PO'd at the WBC at the time. So then it was announced that he would actually drop down to 154 pounds, not Canelo weight, 154 pounds, to face Liam Smith. And Liam Smith at the time was undefeated. He was WBO super welterweight world champion. Many of us felt that this was a bit of a cherry pick. It was on pay-per-view, this fight, by the way, but it was in the A&T Stadium in Texas, and it really was a showcase for Canelo. Now, Billy Joe Saunders, interestingly enough, was meant to be on the undercard. I think he was meant to fight... Was he meant to fight Willie? No, he was meant to fight Gabe Rosado, I think. And I don't think he could make weight. So Rosado ended up fighting Willie Monroe, lost that fight, actually, funny enough. And that kind of went up in the air. So Canelo went in there, Couldn't miss Liam Smith with anything. Liam Smith was target practice. Showed more heart than his brother Callum did when he fought Canelo, to be fair. But he was taken out with a body shot. Beautiful setup with the body shot. Beautiful left hook to the head. Came down straight with the body. So he kind of brought the hands up and then boom, into the body, into the rib cage. Liam Smith was, taken out badly by that. Again, Canelo at that time was showing some, not to say stamina issues, but he definitely was. He was fading a bit as fights went on. But Liam Smith had the style to really, make Canelo look $1 million. Canelo didn't need to go looking for him. He just came straight at him. Then it was like, will we get Golovkin? We were hearing the name David Lemieux being mentioned at the time. But then, kind of Christmas time 2016, started hearing a name that I never thought I would hear Canelo Alvarez being put in the ring with. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. At a catch weight of 164 pounds? Really? At the time, I remember scratching my head thinking, this is a man who said he's not a middleweight, Canelo. And now he's going to fight at 164 over the middleweight limit, the super middleweight, against Chavez Jr. Really? That was what happened. That was what announced. That's who Canelo fought. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in May of almost a year to the date after Amir Khan. In May of 2017. Chavez Jr. was absolutely dead. He looked atrocious on the scales. Didn't do diddly squat in that fight. Canelo Alvarez won it on every scorecard, won every round. Chavez Jr. really did a poor job. After that fight, the famous...
Who is it?
Golovkin, you are next, my friend.
I always found that funny. I don't know why. I always found that just call out funny. But yes, we got Triple G in May. I was looking forward to it. Everyone was looking forward to it. We were all looking forward to it. Didn't really know what was going to happen. Canelo fought Triple G, and there was controversy. A lot of controversy. Oh boy, a hell of a lot. Howard Letterman had Canelo winning at the time. He had Triple G winning. At the time, I thought a draw was fair. To be honest with you, Triple G won the fight. But the biggest issue was, remember I mentioned Adelaide Bird earlier, and how she had Amir Khan winning or up on the scorecards at the time of the stoppage? Well, Triple G, in my opinion, won this fight. One judge scored Triple G 115-113. The other judge had it a draw. Adelaide Bird, she scored this fight 118-110 for Canelo? Really? What the hell fight were you watching? Yeah, Canelo won rounds. He didn't win 10 of them. He did not win 10 rounds. That's where the controversy comes, because Canelo with the scorecards, even if he wins the fight and it's a nip and tuck fight, he gets a scorecard which is so unreflective of what actually took place. So we were going to get a rematch. Triple G versus Canelo. Rematch was set in stone for May of 2018. And then Canelo got popped. He failed the drugs test, I should say, for clenbuterol. Now, we got the excuse of tainted meat, and the WBC, who Canelo once had not been on good terms with, exonerated him and said, no. Logical explanation is tainted meat. And I do remember a story several years back. Was it the Mexican football team? I think it might have been. It was a football team, certainly, who I think said that it was something similar happened. It was definitely something to do with. It was a football team anyway, with regards to clenbuterol. I can't remember exactly, but it wasn't a well-known team. I'll put it like that. Obviously, we know about it then. I think it was a Mexican team or someone like that who said they had that similar issue where members of the team had clenbuterol in their system, trace elements of it. So he was exonerated by the WBA and the WBC. Golovkin fight ended up getting pushed back to September. Now, at the time, it was interesting because going into the first fight, we were seeing Canelo looking jacked, looking huge. We were seeing him looking a bit slimmer by his standards going into this rematch. So people were asking the question, is he going for speed? What's he doing? Well, he fought Triple G. He went Mexican. And in my opinion, it was a majority decision. Canelo Alvarez got the win. I'm going to tell you, I have no issue with that. I have the scorecard actually saved here, and I remember this well because I scored the fight on the night. And this is the original scorecard from when I watched the Canelo Triple G fight all the way back in 2018. You can disagree with me if you want. We're all open to disagree. But first 3 rounds, Canelo. 4th round, Golovkin. 5th round, Golovkin. This is the original one I watched at the time. 6th round, Canelo. 7th round, Canelo. 8th round, Golovkin. 9th round, Canelo. 10th round, Golovkin. 11th round, Golovkin. 10th round, Canelo. So I had it 115, 113 to Canelo. Now, if you had Golovkin winning, I'm not arguing. But I did feel that that was a fair result that Canelo won. The first fight, no, shouldn't have been a draw. Second fight, I felt Canelo made the adjustments and he won the fight. I really do. Kind of question was then, what's he going to do next? Who's going to be next? Danny Jacobs? Well, no, he's actually going to go in Madison Square Garden in February, and he was going to fight Rocky Fielding. So that was going to be a super middleweight. I remember the fight well. I didn't watch it live. I remember what I planned on watching that fight live, but I was seeing someone from Belfast at the time, and she wanted to meet up, so I ended up meeting up with her that night. So that fight I caught the morning after. It was literally just cannon fodder for Canelo. He literally just beat Rocky Fielding down. I mean, it was for the WBA regular super middleweight world title, which I think Canelo instantly vacated after, because it was literally just you're a 3 division? Yeah, you're a 3 division world champion in name only. It's not, that regular title is about as useful as an IBO title, to be honest with you. So then it was a case of coming back down to middleweight for a unification against Danny Jacobs in a fight that I felt he won. It was very competitive. Danny Jacobs did very well at times, but Canelo Alvarez showed the improvements. He showed the head movement that, has just come leaps and bounds. He showed good speed, good punch selection, the ability to go to head and body. Very good performance from Canelo. Very complete performance, I feel. It was very complete. Danny Jacobs had his moments of success, but Canelo Alvarez won the fight. Close on the scorecards by all accounts, which is very rare for Canelo. And then it was the question, well, what's next? Super middleweight? Nope. Light heavyweight. Amazingly, this was a legit 3 division world champion against Sergey Kovalev. Now, Kovalev many years back was feared, but at this stage, he'd seen better days. He'd coming off the back of a very, very tough fight in Russia against Anthony Yarde, extremely hard. And it's safe to assume, he'd seen better days. He had seen better days. Canelo in that fight, it was very bizarre, almost. It was Kovalev just jabbed. That's all he did. And in the 11th round, Canelo Alvarez closed the show out of nowhere, because it didn't look like we were going to get a knockout at all. And Canelo Alvarez knocked Kovalev damn near. That's the worst knockout loss of Kovalev's career. And people tried to claim that he was staging that. Never in my life have I seen a knockout as clear as that. Like, you could not fake that movement, what Kovalev was doing when he collapsed to the canvas. Couldn't fake that. So that was a light heavyweight world title, which he picked up, subsequently vacated. It would be over a year before we see Canelo in the ring. And then that would be against Callum Smith. This was for the vacant WBC super middleweight world title, which was vacated by Dave Benavidez a few months earlier because he missed weight. Callum Smith already had a WBA title. So Canelo Alvarez went in and he picked up that. He cleaned up house. Callum Smith survived more so than anything else. And he was able to get the win. We move on to this year. Canelo Alvarez has fought 3 times this year. Had a run out against Avni Yildirim in February. Less said about that, the better. Unified against Billy Joe Saunders in a fight in which he looked quite good. Parts of that fight, Billy Joe had success, but for the most part, Canelo was doing quite well. And then became undisputed in his last fight a couple of weeks back against Caleb Plant. Undisputed super middleweight world champion in less than a year. It's a pretty good achievement. When I look at this resume and I read some of the names: Sergey Kovalev, Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Amir Khan, Miguel Cotto, Erislandy Lara, Austin Trout, Shane Mosley, Alfonso Gomez, Alfredo Angulo. Who else? Baldomir. Some good names on this resume, people. Whether you agree with some of the decisions or not, whether you think they were in their prime or not, some very good names, some very good achievements. I mean, Sergey Kovalev had seen better days. Yes, we won't argue about that. But to go to light heavyweight, and bear in mind, just 2 years earlier you were fighting at middleweight. Just 3 years earlier you were fighting at 154 pounds. That's pretty impressive. I gotta say it is. 4-weight division world champion in higher weight classes, which I do think takes a little bit more because these guys are bigger, a lot bigger, and the weight discrepancy is often quite vast at these weight divisions. To now next year potentially be a 5-division world champion going in there and facing Ilunga Makabu. I mean, people, when we say what the F is the deal with Canelo Alvarez, he really is aiming for glory. The question is, where would you rank him with Mexican fighters in terms of the all-time greats? I think me and many others would have Chavez Jr. at number 1. Would I have Canelo at number 2? Yeah, at this stage, I wouldn't have an issue with someone putting Canelo at number 2. Would I have him number 2? Him, Morales, you got guys like Marquez, Barrera. What Canelo was doing is, whether you agree with, the level of competition in the respective divisions, like super middleweight, for example, you can only beat the guys who are in front of you and still achieving things that, in the whole time of super middleweight, there's never been an undisputed champion. He's done it in a year. If he decided to go to light heavyweight next year, there could potentially be a case that he could do that in similar time. Now, I don't think it would be near as easy as it was at super middle, but potentially that could happen. We've got a very, very talented fighter on our hands. Some people's consensus pound for pound number 1, other people have Usyk, respectively. I really could say either one because they're both incredible fighters. But we've seen a boy grow to a man, get taught some lessons along the way by Floyd Mayweather, but take them lessons and make himself into a better fighter. And I believe he is a better fighter. I think there are still some things there. You're never going to get the perfect fighter. But right now we have a very, very, very talented fighter in his prime. And to think he still has a good... How old is Canelo now? 31? He's got a good 3-4 years before we probably start to see him slow down. What could he do in that amount of time? That's the question. Very talented fighter, people. Very talented. So we might not agree with some of his, conduct, etc. As a fighter, he is talented. We can all argue. We're not going to disagree on that. He's a very talented fighter, and I'm interested to see what 2022 holds for him. This has been fun talking about his career. I only planned on doing synopsis of it, but when I look back and I get that memory, like, oh, I remember that. Like the Alfredo Gomez fight and the Alfredo Aguilar fight. I remember all them. The Austin Trout fight, I was just starting to really get into boxing as a hardcore, and I remember that fight. So yeah, it was a fun little trip down memory lane for me as well. That's my video. My thoughts on Canelo as well. I hope you enjoyed this little trip we had looking at his resume, looking at his career. Obviously, when it's all said and done, we'll do another one, whenever that may be, more in depth. But for now, I'll leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you could, smash the like button. It helps your boy out. Subscribe if you haven't already. Have a look in the pinned comment section for that little website I've left the link to. And if you could, hit the all notification bell. Peace.